Moving on to lesson 5.2, absolute value. So this lesson is pretty short. We only have 2 vocab words that we are working with, opposites and absolute value. Now the term opposites we're probably fairly comfortable with, right? So opposite of up is down, opposite of down is up, opposite of left is right. Our normal opposites that we think of. When we think of the opposite of a positive number, it's a negative number. Opposite of a negative number is a positive number. So opposites, the numbers that are the same distance from 0 in opposite directions. Now, what is confused a lot is the definition of opposites and the definition of absolute value. Absolute value is the distance from 0 on a number line. So opposites are talking about the same distance on the opposite side of the number line. So if I'm talking about opposite of 5, which is positive 5, right? Well, the opposite of positive 5 would be negative 5. But absolute value can never be negative. So if I said the absolute value of 5, well, the absolute value of 5, how far away from 0 is 5? It's just 5, right? It's 5 units. It's 5 hops. Absolute value is always, always, always going to be positive. This star that's in pink where it says always positive only applies to absolute value. And that needs to be starred, highlighted, circled, squared, something so that you know that is super, super duper important. Opposites, if I say opposite of negative 20, well, it's going to be positive 20. If I say opposite of positive 32, the opposite of positive 32 is negative 32. Opposites can be negative. Absolute value cannot be negative because it's talking about the distance. When you drive, whether you drive forward or backward, the distance that shows up on your odometer is still going to be a positive number, right? You could put your car in reverse, which is kind of like a negative, right? It's kind of like moving backwards on the number line, which would go into the negatives. You could put your car in reverse and drive 15 miles. It's not going to show negative 15 on the odometer, right? It's going to show positive 15. Your car has traveled 15 miles. Distance is always positive. Even if you run backwards, if you are tracking your steps, it's still going to tell you that you ran, 30 steps, right? It's not going to say negative 30. It's not going to take 30 off of your pedometer, right? So, absolute value is shown using absolute value bars. Now, sometimes it gets a little tricky because these bars, if you're not careful, could look like ones, right? But you would see, for instance, if I said absolute value of negative 3, right? That's what those bars mean. Those bars mean absolute value. They're called absolute value bars. So sometimes it'll just say in a word problem, what's the absolute value of negative 3? Or sometimes it'll show you something like this, right? It'll have these bars and have the negative 3 inside of it. And you'll have to know that these bars mean absolute value. It's not 1, negative 3, 1. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and write this number line. And let's remind ourselves, these absolute value bars, it's not 1, negative 5, 1. It's absolute value of negative 5. So that's saying, how far away, what's the distance from 0? So if we look at negative 5 on a number line, which is what I've drawn right here. Negative 5 on the number line, it's saying, how far away is negative 5 from 0? Well, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? It's 5 units, 5 hops, whatever. It's 5 units away from 0. So absolute value of negative 5 is just 5. I'll give you a second to write that down. Absolute value of negative 52 is positive 52 because it's 52 spaces away from 0 on the number line. But if I said, what's the opposite of 6? Remember, opposite's not the same as absolute value. So opposite of 6 would be negative 6. But absolute value of 6, how far away is 6 from 0 on the number line? It's 6 spaces. Now, the first few examples, we're talking about opposites. Keep that in mind. So have a highlighter out. Get a highlighter if you don't already have one near you. And let's highlight the word opposite, because we need to remind ourselves we're not talking absolute value here, we're talking opposite. So what's the opposite of negative 5? Well, the opposite of negative is positive, so it's positive 5. Now remember, you don't have to put the positive sign there. You could just say 5, right? Because positive 5 and just 5, whether you write the plus sign or not, you know that it's positive. Okay. Example 2. Opposite, find the opposite of the opposite of 4. Okay, well, we've got to break that down. So first, opposite of 4 is negative 4. But then it says opposite of the opposite. So if the opposite's negative 4, then the opposite of that must be positive 4. So we start back at the beginning, right? We started with a positive 4, we end with a positive 4. So that's like saying, what's the opposite of up? It's down. Well, what's the opposite of that? It's up, right? So if you take the opposite twice, you just get back to where you started. Alrighty. We're going to complete the got it's on page 356, A and B. I'll pause the video, and then we'll put those into the chat box before moving on. Alrighty, example 3. Now let's highlight. We're working with absolute value, so no longer opposites, just absolute value. What's the absolute value of negative 7? Well, that's really asking us, how far away from 0 on the number line is negative 7? And if it helps you to draw a number line, you're welcome to do that. So if negative 7 is right about here, how many jumps does it take to get to 0? Well, 2, 4, 6, and one more, 7. It took 7 jumps to get from 0 to negative 7. So the absolute value of negative 7 is 7. Remember those absolute value bars. Example 4. So here we've got the absolute value bars. So really this is saying evaluate the absolute value of negative 3. So the question is, how far away from how far away from 0 is negative 3? Well, it's 3 spaces, right? So if you're at 0, you have to go negative 1, negative 2, negative 3 on a number line. It's 1, 2, 3 spaces. So absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Alrighty, example 5. Evaluate absolute value of 5 plus the absolute value of negative 6. So we treat this kind of like parentheses. So let's work each of these terms individually, and then we'll add them. What's the absolute value of 5? Well, 5 is 5 spaces away from 0. So absolute value of 5 is 5. Absolute value of negative 6, well, negative 6 is 6 spaces away from 0. So absolute value of negative 6 is 6. And then we just work like order of operations. 5 plus 6 gives us 11. As soon as you find the absolute value of that number, you do not have to keep the absolute value bars anymore. As soon as you find it, you drop those absolute value bars. Alrighty, example 6. Evaluate the absolute value of negative 7 minus absolute value of 3. Let's try this on your own. Type it into the chat box, and then we'll check it. Absolute value of negative 7. Negative 7 is 7 units away from 0. Bring down the subtraction. Absolute value of 3. 3 is 3 units away from 0. 7 minus 3 is 4. Alrighty, we're going to finish up with some got it's here. Got it's on page 357, C through E.